This is part 3 of The Winged Warrior. How was Paris? Asked Captain Price. Two beautiful French gals showed me the town, and I think one of them fancies Will, joked Fred Libby. Oh, quit that now, I replied. Sea Flight is scheduled for a patrol of the Lions at 10, said the captain. So get a good breakfast, and then meet me in Sea Flight hangar at 9:30. At the appointed time, the crews of Sea Flight met in the canvas hangar that stored their scouts. The mechanics were loading ammunition to the Lewis guns. Other mechanics were checking over the Gnome rotary engines. I did a walk around and everything on my kite looked in order. My scout's ground crew rolled the aeroplane onto the field. Sergeant Clark and I climbed into our cockpits. Within minutes, we were high above the aerodrome and forming up in a diamond formation. Captain Price, as our flight leader, had the front position of the diamond, and I was in the tail end spot. My job was to make sure that enemy scouts did not sneak up on us from behind, and so I had to constantly look over my shoulder. The silk scarf I wore helped prevent my flight jacket's collar from rubbing my neck raw with the constant turning of my head. As we patrolled up and down the front, we were constantly harassed by German Archie, and whenever the black puffs began to get too close, Captain Price would change course to throw off the Hun's aim. Yet one explosion came uncomfortably close to hitting my scout. Our formation was flying along, and the black puffs began to appear close to our altitude and about 100 yards off of our right wingtip. All of a sudden, boom! One exploded close to my scout. My little kite jumped several feet higher, and I saw several tears in the fabric of my craft's right wings. I hoped the fabric would hold together and not rip apart. I didn't want to crash in no man's land. I zoomed forward and got Captain Price's attention. I motioned with my hands that I had a problem with my craft and needed to leave the formation. Our sea flight still had 45 minutes to go on patrol, so the captain gave me the thumbs up to leave. I throttled back and began to descend while the rest of the formation continued on. As I approached my aerodrome, I felt thankful that a Fokker Eindecker hadn't attacked me while my scout limped home. I made a nice landing and taxied up to the Sea Flight hangar where my craft's ground crew was waiting. When the chief mechanic saw the rips in my kite's wings, he just smiled and told me he'd patch it up in no time. Christmas was fast approaching, and so far I survived nearly 2 months of combat without being killed. Part of this was due to good advice from Captain Price when I had joined Sea Flight. He told me not to try too hard at shooting down an enemy aeroplane, but rather concentrate on not being shot down myself. He told me to watch for little specks in the sky, for they often turned into attacking Hun scouts. A couple of days before Christmas, I was sitting on my cot, getting ready to climb under two warm blankets, when a thought came to me. Fred, I heard that on Christmas Day 1914, all the fighting along the British-German front stopped, and that the soldiers played football in no man's land. British teams against German teams. Do you think something like that will happen again? Nope, I just don't see it happening, he replied. The war has got too savage in the past year for anything like that to occur again. Too bad, I commented and crawled under the blankets. Before I drifted off to sleep, I thought about my mother back home. I knew she was worried about me, and I was sure she was praying for me each night. This would be my first Christmas away from home. I was a little homesick. On Christmas Eve morning, we woke to a light coat of snow. It had snowed the previous night, and everything in sight had turned to a beautiful frosty white. B Flight had been assigned to patrol the lines in the late morning, and our flight was assigned to an afternoon patrol. The squadron had mail call just before lunchtime, and I was excited to get two letters. One was from my mother in Miami, and the other was postmarked Paris. I quickly opened the one from Paris. It was from Michelle. She wrote me a 2-page letter describing how much she enjoyed showing me around the city, and happily surprised to find a lock of her hair included in my envelope. That was sweet of her to give me a token of her friendship. That letter made this an especially nice Christmas Eve, and as a result, I had a little extra spring in my step for the rest of the day. Our afternoon patrol on Christmas Eve was uneventful. Things were quiet on the Western Front, and during our 2 hours of flying over the lines, we did not see a single enemy aeroplane. The next morning, Major Reese gave us the good news that the squadron was standing down for the day. We were not scheduled for any patrols, but our 3 flights would take turns in standby mode. Then he gave us even better news. Our Christmas dinner would be delicious. The cook was serving us roast goose, roasted potatoes, and Brussels sprouts. Then, for dessert, we would get mincemeat pie and Christmas pudding. On Christmas Day, many of our airmen walked to the village church to celebrate Mass. And after that huge Christmas dinner of roast goose, all I wanted to do was take a nap. But my fellow pilots talked me into playing cards with them. We played several different games, including penny poker, at which Fred excelled, winning a pile of those huge British pennies. The next day was busy as usual. Sea Flight was scheduled for a mid-afternoon patrol. My observer, Sergeant Alan Clark, came down with some kind of stomach illness and reported to the infirmary, so I was assigned a Corporal Jack Fields in his place. Only 2 scouts from our flight were scheduled to make this patrol. Lieutenant Insel and I flew our scouts side by side over the front on an afternoon with many dark clouds in the sky. We flew into a large cloud that was dark and very moist. When flying, you used the horizon as a point of reference, but when flying through a cloud, you had to watch the instruments on your dashboard. To fly straight, you checked your bubble, like a carpenter's bubble, to see if you were beginning to bank to the left or to the right, and you checked your airspeed. If you went faster, you were in a dive. If you went slower, you were in a climb. So after exiting the cloud, I spotted a Hun two-seater about 2,000 feet below and to our left. His observer was busy taking photos of the British trenches and with any luck would not spot us until it was too late. I wagged my wings to inform Lieutenant Insel of an enemy machine and started into a dive. I dived right at the Hun, and when we got within 300 yards, Jack Fields opened up with his machine gun. Our first shots woke up the German observer, who quickly grabbed his machine gun and opened up on us. The Hun's tracers were coming up at us, and I could see his aim was good. Suddenly, Corporal Fields was hit and slouched over his gun, dead. A split second later, it felt like a hammer hit me in the head. I blacked out. I gradually regained consciousness, but my mind was in a fog. I realized my scout was in a dive, and I pulled the joystick back with all my might. The aeroplane leveled out, not more than 300 feet above no man's land. I headed west into friendly territory with German infantry shooting at me as I retreated home. It didn't take me long to fly over the British trenches, and that was a good thing because darkness was beginning to close in on my sight. I was about to black out. If I didn't put my kite down soon, there would be a hell of a crack up. Luckily, right in front of me was a meadow. I switched off my engine and glided in. I was only 2 or 3 feet off the ground when darkness overcame me. There was light. I opened my eyes. I'm alive. But where am I? Then the sounds and smells of a hospital made it quite clear. I looked down at myself and found that my left arm and left leg were in a cast. Also, using my right hand, I felt my head and discovered that the top part of my head was wrapped in bandages. Well, I'm glad to see you're awake now, said a pretty Red Cross nurse. How long was I unconscious? I asked. This is the 4th day since they brought you in, she replied. You had a nasty gash on your scalp, and your left leg and arm was broken. Where am I? I asked. You're in hospital in Amiens, she said, with an East London accent. Take this pill. She handed me a glass of water and a large white pill. I took the pill and gulped down the water. The nurse had a kind face. I finished off the glass of water and said, "Could you do me a favor?" "What can I do for you?" "Could you please write a couple of letters for me before you get off duty?" She smiled. "Sure, love." About an hour later, the kind nurse returned with a fountain pen and paper. She sat down in a bedside chair. I dictated a short letter to my mother and to Michel in Paris, informing them that I was in the hospital at Amiens, but I was not seriously hurt. I didn't want them to worry. That afternoon, I had a surprise visit from four of my mates. Captain Price, Lieutenant Libby, Lieutenant Insel, and Sergeant Clark all showed up to check on me. "Can anyone tell me what happened when I made that emergency landing?" I asked. "Some chaps in the Royal Artillery Battery saw your crash landing. They said your observer was slumped over his gun. Your kite was gliding in for a landing. When about a yard off the ground, you started to nose down. Your undercarriage was crushed in the hard landing. They ran over to pull you out of the wreckage," said Captain Price. "I guess I'm lucky to be alive. That German observer was a hell of a sharpshooter. Too bad about Corporal Fields." "Yes, rotten luck for him. He was a good bloke. We had his funeral 2 days ago, and he's buried in the village courtyard," explained Captain Price. Lieutenant Insel leaned forward and said, "I tried to get the bugger that shot you, but he escaped into a large cumulus cloud." "Too bad," I said. A middle-aged nurse walked up. "I'm sorry, gents, but I need to change the lieutenant's bandages. You're going to have to leave." And so for the next 6 weeks of 1916, I was totally bedridden. My injuries could have been my ticket home, but no, all I could think about was getting back to my squadron and flying again. Once a week, my mates came by to check on my progress, but the highlight of my stay in the hospital was the 3 times Michelle came to visit. Seeing her again was so encouraging. Each time it brightened my day and brought me out of my gloomy mood. The day they took off the cast, I felt like singing an opera. It was such a relief to give my limbs freedom again. But I was told I still needed a month of therapy before I could put my uniform back on. Also, after completing my therapy, I would be given 2 weeks' leave. Captain Price was kind enough to invite me to stay in Norwich with his family during my leave time. Yet all I could think about was going back to Paris and seeing Michelle. Then I had a brilliant idea. I would spend 4 or 5 days in Norwich with the Price family and a couple of days sightseeing in London, and then travel to Paris to see Michelle for the last half of my leave. I arrived in Norwich during the first week of April. The English countryside was ablaze with color. A multitude of flowers were in bloom. The Price family welcomed me into their home. Captain Stephen Price's wife, Jane, and little 2-year-old daughter, Annie, were staying with the good captain's parents. They had a guest room ready for my stay, and it was really swell to be part of a family again. The highlight of my stay was with the Price family was the beautiful spring day. We all went on a picnic beside the River Winsome. We enjoyed bread and cheese washed down with a glass of wine. Jane looked worried. "Will, how is my husband doing?" "He makes an excellent flight commander," I said, "and can take care of himself in a tight situation." While we enjoyed the sunshine of this beautiful day, little Annie was running around picking wildflowers to give to her mum. The whole thing was so relaxing, it was hard to realize that a bitter war was going on. My time in London was short but sweet. In the short time I was there, I visited the Tower of London, saw Buckingham Palace where King George lived, and spent hours in the British Museum gawking at the antiquities. Then it was on to Victoria Station to catch a train to Paris. How excited I was when the train pulled into Paris. I couldn't wait to see Michelle. My time in Paris was precious. I spent every waking moment either with Michelle or visiting the many museums of Paris while Michelle took classes at the university. During my time in Paris, Michelle and I spent hours talking in our favorite cafe. And then there were the strolls along the Seine, holding hands. It was all so romantic. On the last night I would spend in Paris, Michelle and I were sitting on a park bench looking out over the river. The moon was visible as a thin crescent on this dark night. I put my arm around her and she leaned her head on my shoulder. I think I'm falling in love with you, I told her. She smiled and gazed into my eyes. In a magic moment, I drew her close and we kissed. It was all beautiful. And I wish the romantic moment could have lasted longer, but right then I heard the hum of a distant engine high above us. Searchlights began searching the Parisian sky. I think a Zeppelin is making a raid on Paris tonight. Maybe we should take cover, I said. We ran for cover. There was an explosion in the river with a fountain of water blowing high into the air. Then half a dozen more explosions went off about a quarter of a mile from where we were sitting. The Germans were taking the war to the French capital, and they nearly made us victims. The day I returned to number 11 Squadron, they had a big welcoming party at the officers' mess for me. It was good to see the old veterans again, although I didn't recognize some new faces in the crowd of well-wishers. After a hearty supper, we all gathered around the piano and had a jolly good time singing a medley of our favorite songs. My cot was lost to a replacement pilot while I was in the hospital healing up from my injuries, so I was assigned to another tent. My new tent mates were two new guys to the squadron, Lieutenant Peter Cook and Lieutenant Albert Ball. I found out that Peter Cook was from Cambridge. He was fresh out of flight school in England and didn't have many hours of flying time. I needed to teach him everything I could as quickly as possible so he could survive those first crucial weeks of combat. On the other hand, Albert Ball had lots of flight hours logged. He had been a reconnaissance pilot on the two-seat BE-2C, but asked for a transfer to a fighter squadron to more effectively serve his king and country. He was from Nottingham and just as young as me. He seemed rather shy. Just before I returned to 11 Squadron, the squadron was re-equipped with 14 brand new FE-2B Scouts. The FE-2B was a two-seat pusher scout similar to the Vickers Gunbush, but with a stronger engine and was 10 miles per hour faster. Our squadron also received one single Bristol Scout and two single-seat French Nieuports. Lieutenant Albert Ball went to our squadron commander, Major Reese, and requested that he be assigned the Bristol Scout. He explained that he preferred to fly alone, that by flying as a lone wolf he felt confident that he could score victories against the Huns. Major Reese granted his request. Sure enough, on the 16th of May, while flying a Bristol Scout, Lieutenant Ball used his flying skill to sneak up on a German reconnaissance two-seater. He peppered the belly of the enemy aeroplane and sent it crashing to the ground. Normally, whenever a pilot scored a victory, there was a party in the mess that night. But Albert Ball didn't want a big celebration for his first aerial victory. He was a loner who enjoyed playing his violin at night. On that evening, Ball got out his violin and played Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. His violin music was just beautiful. I reclined on my cot and fell asleep to the harmonic melodies of his playing. Thank you for watching part 3 of 4 of The Winged Warrior.